So thank you so much. It is really wonderful to see you all here to share this evening with us. My name is Gabrielle Hosein. I am the head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. Our Symposium, Indigenous Geographies and Caribbean Feminisms, Common Struggles Against Global Capitalism, is co-coordinated with Levi Gaiman of the Department of Geography, who you will be meeting a little later this evening, as well as some of our supporters in other faculties, or particularly the Faculty of Law. But let me formally welcome you. So good evening, sisters and brothers, grandmothers, mothers, workers, leaders, and healers. In 1492, the current world order was established, and the Caribbean was ground zero. Dispossession of indigenous peoples was the first founding act. Today, we in Trinidad, once Kairi, all live on occupied land. Across the Americas, indigenous sovereign nations of people are still living under post-colonial rule and continue to challenge and refuse a global political economy built on invasion, decimation, and extraction. Indigenous people didn't become extinct. They don't belong to a time past, and their systems of governance, economic management, and ecology are not outdated. Indeed, indigenous communities across the Americas are at the forefront of waging struggles against corporate capitalism's state-managed privatization of water and destruction of forests, precisely because they have kept alternatives alive over all these centuries. And this is one of the reasons why our symposium is titled as it is. In coming together this evening, we do so in the spirit of remembering indigenous Honduran environmental activist Berta Cáceres, a leader with the Civic Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, who was assassinated just a year ago for her defiance to mining and logging concessions and proposed dams. And we want to remember Miriam Chamorro, also, who has taken on her work wherever she is, wherever you are. And we remember movements such as the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, now more than 30 years strong, who offer real living examples of dignity, autonomy, and justice in which we can all find new forms of order, labor, and exchange. And indeed, Zapatista solidarity work was something that inspired Dr. Levi Gaiman's investment in this conference, which he will be talking about later. But before remembering Berta Cáceres, let us remember Ana Kauna, a Taino cacique or chief who ruled the island of Quisqueya, later called Hispaniola, and now known as the Dominican Republic and Haiti. In 1503, during a meeting of 80 caciques, including Ana Kauna, the Spanish governor ordered the meeting house to be set on fire to burn them alive, similar to what occurred centuries later to Rigoberta Menchu's family in Guatemala. Cacique Ana Kauna was arrested and accused of conspiracy for resisting occupation and sexual concubinage as an escape. She refused and was executed and was only 29 years old. Given that indigenous people are still here and still resisting, claims to repatriation of land remain as valid in 2017 as they did in 1493. Colonization is not an event that happened. It's a structure that organizes indigenous communities' lives today as it does ours. Let us not feign innocence about our own entanglement in the continued disruption that occurs in indigenous people's lives from the violation and violence of such occupation. This is an important question for those of us involved in social justice work. What is the accountability of non-indigenous people and activists to Caribbean indigenous peoples' sovereign right to self-determination? And these are not intellectual musings, but real political questions. For a generation of Caribbean young people who for the first time in history are experiencing biodiversity and climate change and climate changes that may not be reversed during their lifetimes, alternatives to business as usual are ever more urgent. That model, established in and expanded from the region, is not all that is on offer, and it no longer offers us what our futures fundamentally need. This generation of Caribbean children can and eventually must move us from resistance to transformation. And that shift requires us to decide what life and justice look like beyond the selves, narratives, relations, structures, and possibilities built like a chain link fence around us since 1492. There is no lack of realism here. Rather, a clear gaze on the global political economy that is neither timeless nor inevitable. And there's a clear reading of our political choices in this place and time to prioritize truly globally decolonial dreams. No liberatory changes are possible without a vision beyond what is common and currently dominant, yet unsustainable. This generation needs radically transformative ideals as much as the clean air and water that adults have failed to sufficiently fight for. It needs world-changing politics and big ideas and the life force of collective and long-term movements, not merely individual and immediate workforce skills. And I say this coming from the University of the West Indies so that we remember our job is not just to produce students for the workplace. Our job is to produce leaders for Caribbean transformation. Why are we Trinidad and Tobago rather than Kairi? Why do we have British governance structures? Why shouldn't we found just models for the world when an unjust model for the world was founded here from 1492? We must stop seeing our history as beginning and our futures ending with colonization. And for those of us invested in regional women's movements, women's empowerment, equity, rights, and feminisms, it's important for us to learn from and be led by the alternatives long held sacred within indigenous cosmologies and worldviews. It's the governing principle under which indigenous people dream of life, land, and solidarity. And engaging each other to imagine freedom outside of colonial terms is ethical, urgent, and necessary. My goal, and the goal for me in this symposium, is for Caribbean feminist movements to deepen our practices of recognition, inclusion, and solidarity, to make space in ways we still need to do, putting resources we have greater access to, and to figure out what it means to enact these considerations in our everyday work, including at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies and here at UWI. My goal is to continue to usher greater justice, including gender justice, across our differences and our communities, and to continue the work of women such as Cynthia Ellis. Cynthia? Indigenous woman and feminist foremother, to those of us now creating the kinds of gatherings that we hope you will remember in 30 years hence. That's why the title of the symposium, Indigenous Geographies and Caribbean Feminisms, intended to recognize that we live within indigenous peoples' long traversed lands and seas, and that this has implications for all of us committed to regional feminist movement building. We hope to bring all of us together to eventually create an edited collection of all our experiences of struggle, leadership, hope, and wisdom as they emerge from the complexity of this region and reflect the conversations and contributions of those gathered over these 3 days. But more may emerge. Networks, action plans, sand in the gas tank of tractors ready to clear-cut forests, as we heard today. And for this, we are open and willing to listen and even collaborate, or to step back And so, in this spirit, I want to welcome women from Belize, Dominica, Guyana, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, and indeed Trinidad and Tobago, and from Akawayo, Garifuna, Kalinago, Lokono, Arawak, Makushi, Maho, Maroon, Mopan Maya, Kekchi, Maya, Wapichan, Warao, and other communities. I welcome on behalf of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, welcome to Kairi. And I wish you all a wonderful evening with us. Thank you. Professor Rosemary Belle Antoine has been a friend of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies for a long time, and on the University of the West Indies, young heads like myself need older, kind of badass women that we can rely on, right, for advice and support and solidarity. And she's the Dean of the Faculty of Law. We are in the Noor Hassanali Auditorium of the Faculty of Law, and so Dean, Professor Rosemary Belle Antoine, please come and greetings.
One of the nicest compliments I've ever had. Okay. Deputy Principal, Professor Rhoda Reddock, Chiefs of the various indigenous peoples, all women chiefs that I met yesterday, Head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Dr. Gabrielle Hussain, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Faculty of Law, welcome to the hallowed ground of the Noor Hassanali Auditorium. Actually, is named after one of our former presidents, who I think symbolized inclusiveness and justice. And here we do embrace advocacy and a scholarship that we hope understands the role of promoting justice. And there could be no better partner in this work than the IGDS. It has been inspirational in its leadership of all things gender. And we have many points of connection and understanding as sister departments. So it's no surprise that my faculty is very enthusiastic about providing mutual support to this very important symposium under our EU-funded human rights project, which is entitled Growing Capacity for Elevating Human Rights. So we are very honored to be hosting all of you. The focus of this particular gender symposium is of special significance to me on several levels. First, I grew up in Arima, the home of what we used to call, in our blissful ignorance, the Carib community. Because of how I look, because I have a little Chinese in me, people assume that I'm either Coco Payol or Carib. And while I am neither, actually, I was once after a Santa Rosa festival splashed across the nation's newspapers as a young Carib girl. So since childhood, I have had honorary indigenous status and a connection. And later on, I was adopted by the Garifuna peoples, but that's another story. The second connection is about my work on the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, OAS, in Washington, and Gabby has asked me specially to speak about this. The Commission has a key rapporteurship on indigenous rights, and the work is really acknowledged internationally, path-breaking jurisprudence, which the UN and others rely on. I have to confess that I became the rapporteur for indigenous peoples quite unintentionally. I had the portfolio of rights of persons of African descent, and I was very committed to that, busy working on highlighting the issue of criminal justice and race in the US and Canada, and this was before the Black Lives Matter. But then the previous rapporteur retired, and she insisted that I had to take over. I was flattered, but I did not want to give up my Afro-descendants rapporteurship, so my colleagues ganged up on me and suggested that I do both, and so I ended up with two. It turned out to be quite fortuitous in shaping the portfolio to work jointly, uniting these two peoples, both historically marginalized. Key to this was the Garifuna, peoples of African descent. And yesterday we were talking about identity. I'm sure we continue that in indigenous conceptualization. The Carafuna had been siloed, with the issue of race and racism compartmentalized and invisibilized, generally I think in international human rights. So the lessons of intersectionality and the shared sufferings were ignored. One concrete result of this was a report that my rapporteurships did jointly on the impact of extractive industries on rights, where both indigenous peoples and persons of African descent are deliberately included in the title, and I hope you download a copy. My third connection with this symposium has to do with the aspects of the title, Struggles Against Capitalism. This struggle is apparent when we interrogate genuine development, which I believe must be premised not just on civil and political rights, but on economic, social, and cultural rights, and equally applied, of course, education, health, work. The issue of extractive industries or so-called developmental projects has emerged as one of the greatest threats of capitalism against the rights of indigenous peoples. Sadly, the story of indigenous peoples too often is about violations of rights by capitalistic, imperialistic, or apathetic states. It involves genocide and cultural loss, but also defiant resistance and survival. International law now defines rights for indigenous peoples encompassing more than cultural hegemony and extending to the right to property and self-determination, the right to prior consultation and consent. The landmark case from the Inter-American system, our system, Saramaka from Suriname, created a precedent for granting collective rights to land and its natural resources on the basis of historical occupation and cultural affiliation. But today, indigenous people see their hard-fought rights once again being threatened with the advent of extractive industries. For example, I have visited communities in Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia, Chile, USA, elsewhere, where governments have privatized or obstructed water resources because of so-called developmental or tourism projects. In the case of the Navajo, and this is still happening in the States as we speak, it was for a ski resort, thereby starving the indigenous communities of their livelihoods, fishing, farming, right to water, even threatening their very lives, forcing relocation. Similarly, the rape of the forests and mountains causing large-scale devastation and catalyzing climate change. The struggles in the English-speaking indigenous nations are different only in degree, but the underlying themes, exploitation, discrimination, criminalization, undermining of the right to life and livelihoods, and even attempted genocide are replicated. Recently, of course, Guyana discovered oil, so I expect these clashes to escalate. States have obligations to ensure that economic development is not attained at the expense of the fundamental human rights of indigenous peoples. These struggles reveal deep clashes between different philosophical notions of development. The materialistic and inherently unequal version of the capitalistic concept of development, in direct contradiction to the environmentally grounded, equality-driven, collective, people-centered, and spiritual notions of development characteristic of indigenous peoples. These clashes occur not only because of uncaring politicians, but because of the very forces of capitalism and imperialism, and the notion that some people are without value. They are ideological conflicts which penetrate indigenous societies and cause deep divisions even from within. They are powerful, often ruthless foreign companies with lots of money and power here. They come even from good nations like Canada, which at the Commission, and I was the rapporteur for Canada, we targeted under the principle of corporate social responsibility. Well, now there's a good prime minister, so hopefully we get some progress. Further, no, not really? Okay, well, I've left, so I don't know what's going on. Further, law, property, and finance systems uphold the unjust status quo. Property law, which governs land ownership, title, loans, and so on, is framed within individualistic notions of rights and conflict with communal concepts of property evident in indigenous systems. We must constantly challenge these constructs. When I represented the Mapuche peoples of Chile, It was anti-terrorist laws that had been used to quash their assertion of their legitimate rights and to prosecute and criminalize Mapuche human rights defenders. Today we see the Cybercrime Act, and it was discussed yesterday, doing the same in Jamaica for LGBT rights offenders. And of course, we interpret law very restrictively, ignoring the deep spiritual connections to sacred indigenous sites. In Trinidad and Tobago, the Wara talk about the San Fernando Hill, for instance. But we should not be afraid of the notion of conflict. Rather, we must identify, confront, and strategize for these realities. Actually, it was the feminist movement that talked about naming and shaming in sexual harassment cases. The fact is that there's a concerted strategy to divide and conquer, no different from colonial times. It is part of the neoliberal capitalist construct to capture intellectually where the culture and the community is weak. There must be mechanisms, language and so on, and a coherent strategy to strengthen that culture and civilization and prevent the dominant culture overpowering it. Symposia like these can provide support and intellectual leadership to help frame these strategies. In all of these various struggles, feminist dimensions are readily apparent. Many of the women's issues I have been exposed to have been deeply disturbing. I have learned in our hearings and missions of unspeakable tragedies and brutalities perpetrated against indigenous women. The Commission's innovative case law also demonstrates that in times of armed conflict and unrest, and make no mistake, women are targeted. There are clear structural patterns of discrimination and violence. This is really war. And we're seeing some of it in Trinidad and Tobago, I think. Similar kinds of instability, women are being targeted. Our report on missing and murdered indigenous women in Canada is required reading. While it may not be on the same scale, the issues again are familiar here: vulnerability, discrimination, and violence. So-called development projects in Belize, Suriname, Guyana have had deep negative impact, leading also to human trafficking, prostitution, sexual violence, and one we have not mentioned yet, HIV. I did a workshop just 2 months ago, and other diseases, disproportionately so for indigenous women. The right to health, already compromised in remote, neglected indigenous communities, is further undermined. But the stories of indigenous feminism and the struggle are not all tragic. This symposium is about harnessing the positive truths as well. Indigenous women, indigenous mothers are shaping, leading the forces of resistance in different, perhaps gentler ways, too. So while many of our indigenous women have suffered in the militant struggles, I heard yesterday of the many indigenous women who are becoming community leaders, radio communicators, and so on, ensuring that the culture and great civilizations of indigenous women, peoples, are preserved. Language, religion, and culture are important weapons in the battle too. As a feminist conference, I'm sure leadership is something that you've been talking about a lot. Women too are leading and engaging the courts, challenging unequal law and policy. Recently, a landmark case from Belize, CCJ, the Maya Leaders Alliance, which Christina will be talking about, emphasized these rights which indigenous peoples must enjoy and demand. The gifts bequeathed to us from our indigenous history give us an embedded identity, which perhaps we are only now beginning to recognize and value. The indigenous worldview of economic, social, and cultural development is premised not on individualistic notions of want, but on a collective identity and a sacred relationship with nature and ancestors. It can lead us to remembered ways of existing, a return to community-based gift economies and sustainability. History may eventually record our indigenous peoples as the true defenders of our civilization. We all have a duty, NGOs, general public, the church, and I have met many church leaders also in the struggle, and most of all the academy, we scholars, to stand up in solidarity to protect, preserve, not just indigenous rights for justice's sake, but for what many of us believe is the preservation of our very civilization. Indigenous women are at the heart of the struggle. Thank you.
Introduce Professor Velma Newton of the Impact Justice Project from the Cave Hill Campus Faculty of Law. Professor Newton.
Deputy Principal of the St. Augustine Campus, Dr. Rhoda Reddock, Professor Rosemary Antoine, Dean, Faculty of Law, Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, and Dr. Levi Gaiman, who are the conference organizers. Christina Koch, who's the spokesperson for the Maya Leaders Alliance and the Toledo Alcaldes Association, who's the keynote speaker tonight. Cynthia Ellis, outstanding Garifuna researcher and leader. Dr. Melanie Newton, my daughter. Representatives of indigenous people who are coming from so many countries in the region. Gender studies and other students who contributed so efficiently to the organization of this event. All other persons who I have not mentioned, it would have been accidental, and I'm glad to see you all here tonight. Impact Justice was very proud and pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this conference. We got fairly late notice, and we could have done more if we had had earlier notice, but you will remember for next time. This meeting, I said we were pleased, and it was because in February 2016, we organized a conference for indigenous people of the region in Belize, and many of the faces here would have attended there. And we were very happy. We were thinking of some other activities to follow up on that conference. And in fact, we were planning some. So when this one came along, we were, it was a good opportunity for us to do a little more of what we had planned to do. As you know, the Government of Canada is sponsoring the Impact Justice Project. We started out with 19.2 million Canadian dollars. The project is now in its third year. We've made a fairly substantial dent in that amount of money. But the Government of Canada is, one of its the directives to projects that it is funding is to do what we can for indigenous people in the regions where we're operating. And therefore, we're trying to do our part. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Impact Justice. It is, apart from, I just told you about the funding, but what we're trying to do is to improve access to justice for men and women, girls, boys, businesses in the region. And the project has four main components. The largest is drafting model legislation or doing amendments to existing laws at the national level. And so far we have drafted 3 model bills, one on major organized crime, one on sexual harassment, in which we define sexual harassment as any inappropriate touch or contact occurring anywhere. We haven't just confined it to the workplace. And that bill has just gone to CARICOM to be considered as a CARICOM model bill. And we've done a community mediation bill. And then we're working on others, trademarks, there's so many, a new legal profession bill, arbitration, and about 5 or 6 others. We're also looking to review jury legislation, bail legislation, and so on. So we have a fairly active component for under the legislation part of the project. In addition, because one complaint is the shortage of drafters around the region, we've trained so far in 3 years about 20 persons in legislative drafting, both at the Faculty of Law at the Cave Hill Campus and at the Athabasca University in Canada. That is ongoing, and we are very pleased with the reception that we've had from governments around the region and from persons applying to get into the program. Then we work with the bar associations, and I mentioned the Model Legal Profession Act that we're working on. And it is just not to replace an act for the sake of it. We are trying to push continual legal professional education because our view is that just as accountants and doctors have to keep up their standards and their qualifications, so too should the legal profession. That particular provision of the bill has been accepted, I think, by most bar associations. We have to see now when the bill is drafted whether the governments are going to go for it. We're also trying to strengthen disciplinary procedures among the legal profession and their accounting standards, because those are two of the areas that the public complain most about in relation to work with the legal professions. And then we have a public legal education component, and we give lectures under that component. We are working to prepare manuals for persons dealing with children and the disabled before the courts, and a host of other things. But the second largest component of the project is alternative dispute resolution. Under that component, in the last 3 years, we've trained about close to 1,000 persons in mediation and restorative practices, and a smaller number in arbitration. We have not concentrated on arbitration because really it is mainly large companies that use arbitrations so far. Not very many of the poor and disadvantaged that we are aiming to improve or to assist do use arbitrations. And during this year, what we're planning to do is, if the governments do not adopt our community mediation bill that has been completed for about 9 months now, we are urging and will assist persons who have been trained as mediators and restorative practitioners to establish associations where they can practice what they've learned and keep in touch with each other and so on. And the objective is to move towards regional associations in both those areas. So we are pretty busy, and if there are any projects you're working on that fall within our area, you can always write us a letter and we'll see how we can assist. But remember, it has to be on a work plan before we can do anything about it. And just about now, we're preparing our 4th work plan. So if you don't have anything to suggest in the next 4 weeks, you would have to wait until this time next year to send your suggestions in. And we put those suggestions before a series of technical advisory groups that we have, and then what they recommend goes to the project steering committee, which meets once a year. Well, that is impact justice. And I'm very happy to be here this afternoon to see all of you. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Newton. Over the course of these 3 days, we are doing a number of interviews. We hope the interviews will be, they will all be open access. They'll all be online. And we hope that you all can use them in your teaching, your workshops, your advocacy, your consciousness raising, and your movement building. And we wanted to feature 2 of those interviews tonight so that you can see what they look like.